Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's chapter meeting. I'd like to. There we go. Good morning. Welcome to our fourth quarter chapter meeting for the New Jersey and Connecticut Diversity Councils, which will focus on psychological safety in the workplace. This meeting is part 2 of a 2-part series on the topic. My name is Emily, and I am the Tri-State Event Programmer for the National Diversity Council. It is my pleasure to plan events and chapter meetings for the Tri-State Diversity Council and work with our incredible partner organization and advisory board members. For those of you who are attending your first program with us today, welcome. The National Diversity Council aims to promote DE&I efforts within our local workplace and communities. And one way that we achieve this mission is by organizing educational programs like the one today. We would like to greatly thank our corporate partners of the Tri-State Diversity Council and the overarching National Diversity Council for making opportunities like today's possible. If you are interested in learning more about what we do, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. In addition to our chapter meeting learning opportunities, the Tri-State Diversity Council also hosts a number of DE&I events throughout the year. Looking forward to March, we are hosting one of our signature events, the Women in Leadership Symposium, or WILS. Our Connecticut WILS will be held virtually on Zoom on the first day of Women's History Month, March 1st, to kick off our WILS season. Our New Jersey Women in Leadership Symposium will be held on March 7th at Panasonic in Newark, New Jersey. And our New York WILS will be held on March 14th at New York Law School in Manhattan. We are currently taking Women of the Year nominations and speaker nominations for all 3 markets. If you are interested in becoming an event sponsor or would like to learn more about sponsorship packages, please email me. More information about our Women in Leadership Symposiums in the months to come. We will also be hosting our next New York chapter meeting on Thursday, November 30th. The topic of the New York meeting will be Women in the Workplace, Strategies for Success Amid the She Session, and feature speaker Mary Pontillo, Senior Vice President, National Fine Art Product Leader for Risk Strategies Company. I will post the link in the chat to learn more and to register for that upcoming New York meeting. Our chapter meetings are always complimentary and open to the public, so we hope to see you at that next meeting. Before we get started, I want to share a few Zoom housekeeping items with you. First, we encourage you to update your name field to include your pronouns. You can do this by clicking the rename option and adding your pronouns there. Please remain on mute if you are not our presenter, one of our presenters, or our moderator. The NDC also has a legal disclaimer about the importance of not sharing, saving, or posting anything from today's segment, as well as ensuring that only approved individuals participate in this session, as others will be held liable for unpaid fees. Lastly, but most importantly, please be sure to place any questions you have for our panelists in the chat box during the presentation. I'll be collecting questions as we go for our 15-minute Q&A session after the panel discussion. If you would like to privately message me your question so it can be asked anonymously to the panel, that is also an option. I would like now to introduce our moderator and our panelists for today's session. Please turn your cameras on, panelists and moderators, so that our attendees are able to see you. Our moderator and facilitator for today's session is Lori Ferguson. After working in human resources for 20 years with a specific focus on diversity and inclusion for the past 10 years, Lori coaches leaders on diversity, health, and fitness to cure the ills in our society through deep and meaningful conversation and intentional action. Lori began her career at Prudential in 1997 and has held multiple positions since. Lori is currently the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey. Welcome, Lori. We are honored to have you as part of today's event. Now I will introduce today's panel. First, I would like to introduce Sean Kosofsky, the nonprofit fixer. He is a coach, consultant, trainer, and strategic advisor. For the past 30 years, he has helped causes, campaigns, and candidates raise millions of dollars and transform nonprofit organizations and leaders. He has worked on a wide range of issues, including DE&I, LGBTQ, equality, reproductive justice, voting access, bullying prevention, climate change, and more. He is an author and the owner of Mind the Gap Consulting, which offers coaching and consulting services for executive directors, boards, and fundraisers, as well as a suite of online training courses. Welcome, Sean. Next, I would like to welcome Timothy Fair, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Burlington Stores. He is charged with providing leadership towards the advancement of Burlington's DEI strategic priorities throughout its corporate, merchandising, and distribution centers. Prior to his time at Burlington, he served as inaugural Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at LSU in New Orleans. Welcome, Timothy. Our third panelist for today is Will Desir, an insurance professional with over 2 decades of progressive insurance experience and specializes in commercial and personal property claims handling, risk management, fraud investigations, and more. Will is with Seneca Insurance, an affiliate company of Crum & Foster, and is dedicated to furthering the understanding, empathy, and awareness of unique issues that affect the Black and Brown communities. Welcome to our panelists, and I will now turn it over to Lori to begin our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Emily. I first would like to start by just thanking my partners on the Education Committee, Sharon Mandel, Kate Dowd, who can't be with us today, but were very, very helpful in helping to pull this panel together. And of course, Denisha Crumpler, who is the chair of our committee, and she has been working tirelessly to ensure that we were able to achieve this today. So thank you to my teammates on this. I also want to welcome Tim, Sean, and Will to the discussion. Thank you all so very much for agreeing to be here with us today. I hope that many of you were able to attend the first session that we hosted on psychological safety, which was about a month ago, maybe less than a month ago, where the team talked about what psychological safety is and went through in-depth discussions about what psychological safety. But what I'd like to do today, since this is part 2, is to give you a high-level overview of what the definition of psychological safety is, and then with the panelists, we'll delve into how organizations can create psychologically safe environments, what people can do for themselves to do that, and what you can do if there are missteps in your plan to create a psychologically safe environment in your workplace. So first, let me share a couple of definitions with you. Psychological safety means feeling safe to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, to disagree openly, to surface concerns without fear of negative repercussions or pressures to sugarcoat bad news. And that's from McKinsey & Company, whom I love. The second definition I have is psychological safety is the belief that one will be punished or will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. In teams, it refers to team members believing that they can take risk without being shamed by other team members. And that's from Wikipedia. not such a reliable source, but I still like their definition. I'm going to start off by asking Will a question. So, Will, can you share with me some strategies that can be implemented to address and manage conflicts in psychologically safe manners? And what I mean by that is from topics of that are happening in the world down to whether or not we should come into the office, what the hybrid schedule it should look like. People have fear sometimes of speaking their truth, sharing their ideas, coming to the forefront with some of the questions that they may have. I would like for you to share what are some things that we can do to address that? How do we create an environment where people feel safe doing that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Laurie. And fantastic question to, to kick things off. And again, I just want to, express my appreciation. I'm honored to be a part of this panel with, with you, with Tim and with Sean, and certainly appreciate the work that Denisha and Emily have done behind the scenes and in getting us together. To manage conflict in a psychologically safe manner, it requires leaders and team members to be both proactive and reactive. Thus, I offer these tools that we can keep in our toolbox in order to address, the things that that we need to bring to the forefront, whether it's conversations with leaders above us or if we're managing below. One, we need to be proactive by establishing clear communication channels and norms. Two, we need to foster an environment of mutual respect. Three, we need to provide regular conflict management training. We're not all born with the gift of managing conflict. This is, a skill that must be developed over time. So certainly, conflict training is something that should be a part of our, toolbox and planning. And then four, we need in terms of being reactive, we need to include promoting a culture of active listening, which is, again, another one of those things that's a skill that needs to be developed over time. Some of us are, very good at it, in terms of listening, but, some of us, particularly those of us that are married, may know that that's not something that we do as good as we think that we do all the time, right? And then we need to encourage empathy and advocating for non-defensive criticism. So those are the items, the four items that I would say as tools that we should have as leaders in our toolbox in order to deal with managing conflict from a psychologically safe manner.
Thank you so much for that, Will. Sean or Tim, do either of you have anything to add to that?
Go ahead, Tim, if you want.
Sure. As I think about the strategies that we can implement to address and manage conflicts, I think one of the strategies that we often don't talk about is that of checking our own implicit biases, right? When we think about who wins in a conflict or who is the person that we believe or how might we go about ensuring that there is like an equitable resolution that happens, oftentimes it's heavily reliant on our ability to really think critically about our own biases, our own triggers, what makes us upset, or what do we believe to be true implicitly. So I have often asked myself, going into a conversation, for example, where I am the person who is supposed to be resolving the conflict, what am I bringing into this space? And how might I perceive this in a way that could or could not be right? And in the event that it is not right, or in the event that it will eventually be right, giving the space and grace for both sides to have that equal space, I think is critically important, and acknowledging both of those sides as you're moving towards that kind of resolution.
Absolutely. And I wrote down what, each of you is saying, and check yourself is what I wrote for you. But Will mentioned, empathy and active listening, and you can't be empathetic or listen actively if you're not first checking yourself, right? Walking into a situation, understanding what your biases may be. So great point. Sean, I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, no, let Sean chime in first.
Okay, Sean.
I'm good. I'll address it on the next question. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Will.
in terms of understanding those those biases, I mean that's a great point, Tim, and I certainly appreciate you bringing that forward. It's not just checking yourself or looking at your own bias, but trying to understand other people's bias, right? Understand their perspective and where they're coming from. Oftentimes we have a tendency of painting folks with with a broad brush, right? That hey, because this person thinks this way, I'm going to put them in this particular box, and not understanding the reasons why that person may be thinking in that in that way. And that's something that we definitely need to take the time to to understand that someone, for instance, how many of us can say that in terms of having others that that doesn't look like us, that's a huge part of whom we're around with on a day-to-day, right? Apart from obviously being in the office, right? So a lot of the interactions that we have, they have a tendency on coming from, a particular, a set of, background or experience. And, and that creates those biases, right? So we have to have that same understanding where we can understand, if we can understand and check ourselves and understand our biases, we can then also understand where, that someone else may not have had the exposure, right, to to understand where I'm coming from. So affording them that that opportunity, having that empathy.
Yeah, so I'm going to share something that sounds silly in my head right now, but it's going to make sense hopefully for you. Denisha and I were talking earlier about cats, and she mentioned, she sees a lot of cat videos or orange cats are like, terrors. And I'm like, my mother had an orange cat. He was the most lovable cat ever. But anything that you put out into the universe as a stereotype, you will see more of that. And people have these preconceived notions about orange cats because of what is shown on videos. People are going to, of course, record the cat doing the most insane things because they want to maintain this label on orange cats. Leave orange cats alone. They're fantastic animals, and the pigment of their skin has absolutely nothing to do with their playfulness, right? So,
Of their fur.
right, exactly. So yeah, so leave orange cats alone, but I think it aligns with those preconceived notions that people have based on media or what they've heard or their one interaction with the orange cat that attacked their leg. That's not all orange cats.
Exactly.
So next question is for Sean. Sean, as the CEO of a couple of organizations and as a leader and helping other leaders to become better leaders, what do you think should be expected of leaders as it regard? Let me state that again. What should be expected of leaders with regards to creating psychologically safe places for their people in their organization? So what do leaders need to do in order to create a psychologically safe environment? They say that the fish starts to stink at the head, right? Like that's a statement that I heard maybe 20 years ago, and I never forgot that. But it also, leadership is top down. What you exhibit at the top is what gets displayed throughout the organization very often. So what do leaders need to do in order to create a place where people feel like they can be themselves and raise their concerns without fear of retaliation?
Yeah, thank you. Again, just delighted to be here today and answer this question about leadership. Psychological safety is required for people to perform their job. Fear has a profound impact on performance and on behavior. So one thing I've always believed is that the top-down approach to sort of like setting a tone, modeling good behavior, setting the expectations of the team is really, really critical. This can't be overstated. I think it's really important in organizations for everyone to behave in a way that's consistent with their values, but for leaders to definitely just be walking the walk and not just talking the talk. So it's going to be like swimming upstream to implement things in an organization if the leadership is just showing up when it's good for a soundbite or a press release or when it's Black History Month or something, and actually like walking the walk throughout the entire year. So on all the areas of diversity, it's really important to be modeling this good behavior from the top down. It's an ongoing muscle that you need to be flexing and practicing, and it starts by setting that tone. And one management device that I think about, which is a way to demonstrate this openness and creating psychological safety, is this sort of like device. You can use it anywhere. You can use it with coworkers. You can use it with people you directly supervise. You could try to use it with a friend. You could even use it with your partner, although watch out for that. But it's this tool, this device I use that's called what I expect and what I see. And this can manage a lot of situations where instead of just coming to someone whose performance is bad or they did something you don't like and saying, you did this thing, you could say, here's what I was expecting, and yet here's what I'm seeing. Can you explain the gap to me? And this way you put it in the other person's hands. And what you get back so often is a rational, practical reason for why they behaved the way they did. And when someone starts watching that you deliver feedback and seek feedback that way, they start using this tool too. So if you're supervising someone, even for a coworker who you don't supervise, I was expecting that this deadline was going to be met at 3 o'clock today, but it came in at 5. Can you explain to me like why there was a difference of opinion or understanding about that? Oh, well, I didn't get the memo about. So you start actually being able to manage conflict and create psychologically safe environments by inviting the person to actually offer their feedback into the answer instead of assuming you know the answer and already coming in guns blazing with accusations. And this device can be used in a lot of different ways. I pull that out a lot to when I'm heading into a possibly conflicting situation, and I encourage leaders and managers to employ this sometimes. Also, another tool that I think leaders can use is something called double loop learning. Anyone who's sort of gone to management school has heard of this term, possibly. There's like single loop learning, which is like, oh, you look at something, you do something and you correct it after you get feedback. But double loop learning is thinking about how you think, like stepping back and thinking about the way you think and the way you process information. So in my last organization, we actually instituted double loop learning at the end of every meeting where decisions were made. And what we did is take 5 minutes at the end of every meeting and said, okay, let's think about the meeting we just had. Did we create the conditions where everyone could be heard? Did we actually create a good meeting where people felt included? Did we set in motion anything that undermined our diversity goals for the year? Did we just assign something to a woman of color too many times during this meeting, or did the white guy talk too much? Or like we actually, by putting that in the agenda and inviting a double loop 5-minute thing, we actually gut check as a device, the thinking about the way that we're thinking. So whenever decisions are being made, we employ a double loop learning sort of thing, and you can use this across an organization. Another tool is just your normal check-in document. We usually ones from the management center and most of the nonprofits that I'm at, and we modify it based on the organization. At the end of your check-in with your direct report, you invite them to give feedback back to you. And then you can encourage them to use here's what I was expecting, but here's actually what I was seeing. Can you please explain why this is happening? But you have to create the conditions for them to give you this honest feedback. And one of the things that teaches people whether you are open to feedback or not is your reaction to things. If you do decide to do this, asking your employees for feedback on your own performance or how you're showing up, be ready for feedback. And if you are naturally defensive, which I can be, you have to be really careful not to immediately explain something or whatever, because then it comes across as defensive or dismissive. Another thing to be careful about when you're seeking input is whether they have ever seen you overreact or whether they've seen you have really negative reactions to things. So they're going to not want to bring you things that give you negative reactions. So these are all things you have to self-monitor. If you are noticing that other people are creating environments, other managers that might be below you, monitoring them, just watching the way they engage with folks. Management by walking around sometimes, just like actually looking at how people are doing things can give you a good input on what's happening across the organization. As a leader, you have to have your antenna up all the time, listening and learning and being aware of whether someone is creating the conditions that are counter to what you're trying to do. Did I just see in this memo, anything going across the organization, something that is challenging to what I'm trying to create here? And then finally, I'll invite folks to look at, there's a book by Amy Edmondson, also about psychological safety, where she has a psychological safety assessment, which is sort of like a little gut check tool that people can use before they, are in team meetings or anything like that. So it sounds like other folks I'll drop the Amazon link into the chat in a second, but those are just some of the things I think leaders can do.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Tim or Will, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next question?
I'll just pop in very quickly to say I totally agree with everything that Sean said. And when I think about some tactical tools that I give leaders around this particular item, one is to make sure that they themselves are at the helm of vulnerability. And what I mean by that is not expecting vulnerability from people that they themselves have not been vulnerable with. And so in my mind, leaders are the architects of the culture of courage. And so if we want our associates to embrace the discomfort related to being wrong and making mistakes, well, when we make mistakes, it's critically important that we model that behavior by saying, you know what, I got it wrong. Or my idea wasn't the best idea in this meeting. And I want to affirm that that was such a more brilliant idea. It didn't mean my idea was bad. It just means it wasn't the most optimal for the work that we're doing in this particular way. And so when you model that vulnerability, more people are inclined to be able to lean into their discomfort around being wrong, making mistakes, and sharing very openly around that. So just kind of wanted to pop in on that.
Another thing I just wrote for you, check your ego, right? That's the other thing, is you can't be vulnerable if you're going in with an ego. Will, anything before I ask my next question?
Just really quickly, I mean, I definitely agree with both Sean and Tim. That question for me, it actually draws out a question within itself. How can leaders help create psychological safety for their organizations if there's no understanding of the makeup of the project teams and the value, voice, perspective each member brings? Which brings in the DEIB component, right? Which I think there's a direct link with psychological safety and DEIB. So leaders need to have that understanding of the project team, its makeup, and as time is progressing, that's certainly something that leaders have to be mindful of, in terms of the makeup of the team, because that team is going to become more and more diverse. As we know, the population is ever changing. By 2035, the dynamics of things will flip, right? Where Black and brown people will actually be in the majority. So these are things which is going to have a direct impact on the project teams, right? Which is going to have a direct impact on the teams that are reporting up to these leaders. So they need to have that understanding in order to be effective as leaders, and in order to create psychologically safe spaces.
Thank you, Will. So my question for Tim, can you share any examples of successful programs or practices for creating psychological safety in your workplace?
Certainly. There are so many ways that workplaces can really prioritize the work of psychological safety. And one of the ways that we've done it at Burlington is really through an unapologetic focus on building out the competencies for psychological safety among our leaders at the VP level and above. And so I shared in my previous answer about the vulnerability required to do that. But we recognize that, that is not necessarily an innate thing that people just show up wanting to be vulnerable. And so we created a 3-month-long educational awareness kind of program, module-based series called Spotlight on Inclusive Leadership. And of those, we focused on 3 topics, one being obviously inclusive leadership, so the 6 C's for inclusive leadership. The other topic was around workplace belonging, so creating an environment for associates at our company to belong. But the third and really foundational piece was that of psychological safety. And so what we did was we invested a lot into building the competency and skill sets of our leaders to do that. We bought everyone at the VP level and above a book by Tim Clark called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. And we had a module where Tim Clark actually did an individualized, personalized module for our associates around and our leaders around what those 4 stages are, right? How can we move towards understanding, but also embedding those 4 different phases in our employee or associate life cycle? And out of that, right, we reinforced that learning. So we had the module, we had the book, but we had what we called spotlight circles that really gave our leaders an opportunity, once every 2 weeks, we'd come together for an hour and discuss the book, the learning, the insights, and quite frankly, the vulnerabilities that are required to do that. So some of our questions were questions that were uncomfortable, that really teased out the discomfort of our leaders, but we intentionally designed this program so that they could be able to practice that muscle that we talked about earlier with respect to psychological safety, so that as they're expecting others to do the same on their team, that they have already understood the vulnerability required to do it. And so building out this language, if you will, of inclusive leadership and psychological safety now allows us to have a common language for what does it mean to have it in our organization. So now we're talking about things like challenger safety or includer safety, wherein 2 or 3 years ago, that language was not present in the organization. And so when you build out this nexus of learning, it really does allow for an organization to change not only its culture, its language, but also its commitment around these particular issues. And so if you're looking for a organizational effort, I really do think that it's a really great model to take your leaders through this practice. It doesn't necessarily have to be that book, although, selfishly, I would say it was an excellent book, but any resources that you're able to give, making sure that you also reinforce those resources with continuous learning and ensuring that individuals are not seeing this as like a one-off.
Tim, how long ago did you do this? And is there any measurable results that you can share, like from the lead? You did it with the leaders, but are you seeing changes in the employee base yet?
We are, and I can say 2 things. One, to answer your first question, this was last fall. So it's been over a year since we really focused on inclusive leadership and psychological safety organizationally. And honestly, what we've been able to see through our annual kind of engagement in Your Voice survey is a precipitous increase in engagement around DEI. And so we're proud to say that DEI is the highest rated indicator in our organization this year. And we do know, right, we can make the correlation between the additional resources, the additional investment, but also programs that are specialized and niche, like this particular program, helping us to get there. And so really grateful to see those measurable results and impact that are really helping us to continue to incentivize this kind of learning.
That's perfect. Does anybody else have anything that they can share about measures of success? Go ahead, Sean.
Well, in terms of like a successful practice, for the team I was at this national climate change organization for the past 4 years, we use something called a feedback and accountability process. So people on the team, we had a very small team. We had a team of 14 people, and folks were saying, how do I give feedback to someone else across the team that isn't my direct report? Like, how do I give, and people were feeling inhibited about giving feedback to someone who was more senior, who had more credentials, who might have been older. And so who am I to give feedback to someone else if they don't report to me, right? So we created a feedback and accountability process. So if someone was missing their deadlines or someone wasn't doing what they needed to do, you could give that person feedback, even if they don't report to you. But in order to do this correctly, we created a document where everyone filled out how they like to get feedback. And this was powerful. Like, don't surprise me during a staff meeting and call me in or call me out. Like, message me privately, let me know there's a concern, and let's hash this up. Some other folks are like, don't tell me on a Friday that I've irritated you, and then we'll talk Monday. I'll be ruminating all weekend. Like, please don't do that. If you've got something that I've done that's bothered you or that isn't right, please just tell me, and tell me quickly, and kind of like private message me on Slack or whatever it is. But people filled out this form saying, this is how I enjoy getting feedback. Some folks were very much like, call me out, I don't care. Other folks were like, please don't do that. But that helped build a muscle. So usually folks would go back to that document on our small team to remember before they gave someone feedback what to do. That is something we found worked for our small team. That is probably very difficult across large organizations, but smaller teams could actually do something like that.
Thank you. And I have a question for you, Will.
Mhm.
So, we all work on teams, whether we love it or not, right? And we have to collaborate across the organization. And in order to do so, there has to be some measure of psychological safety, because we've all encountered that situation where it's like, I have to, reach out to this particular group, but that person's not typically responsive, or they're not the kindest person in the world. I don't enjoy working with them. How can an organization encourage collaboration and teamwork and build out or ensure psychological safety? How can an organization do something like that?
Another great question, Laurie, and I certainly appreciate it. My answer, part of the answer has already been discussed, as both Sean and Tim have provided us with some nuggets already. Leaders are in a unique position to to be change agents who shape the narrative and humanize work culture for all people. To do so, leaders must have these 6 tools that I'm about to share in in their repertoire. Again, some of these I think we've already touched on, but the very first one is be authentic. Definitely have to be authentic. In order to to promote collaboration within within a team. B, we have to create a culture of openness where employees feel comfortable to share ideas, ask questions, express concerns without fear of retribution. To offset fear and to encourage honest discussions. Leaders can model vulnerability and share their own mistakes, which is something that I believe that Tim mentioned earlier. C, I believe that it's necessary to encourage all voices. Leaders can set formal mechanisms to encourage sharing ideas. Here, it's important to recognize an individual's strength to develop mental areas. Someone who's more reserved with their words, or in a meeting, they may have difficulties expressing themselves. Someone like that, you may need one-on-one conversations, to be able to bring out their strength or their contribution.
Or email,
and then speaking,
or IM,
or
right?
email,
Yeah.
or IM, exactly. And then D, we have to, speaking of contribution, we have to appreciate contributions, acknowledge the good job that team members are doing, and then give special thanks to people who bring up uncomfortable and hard issues. And again, that's something that I think over time will help the team, because when they see that, it's going to actually encourage folks to, 1, collaborate, and 2, to bring forward those ideas that that they may deem to be hard issues or even controversial. E, we need to make that and develop norms, right? Encourage team members to give their views, coach the team to support each other, and model that behavior. And then F, we need to ensure equal opportunity and equitable outcomes. Acknowledge each individual's specific needs, right? And addressing those needs. And doing those things, I think, will certainly help the team to collaborate, better from a psychologically safe perspective.
Thank you. Well, I think that those are all fantastic. The one that sticks out for me most is D, acknowledging and appreciating when someone does have a dissenting point of view, or an alternate point of view, because that will encourage other people to say, well, it wasn't that bad. When someone spoke up and they didn't agree with what was going on here,
Right.
they did not get reprimanded. They
Right.
did not, there was no retaliation. There was no admonishment during the session. So that is fantastic. Fantastic advice. Any additional things to add from Sean or Tim on this? You can say no. We have more questions.
I'll just jump in with a quick quote from Peter Drucker. I love quoting Peter. I love quotes, but I love Peter Drucker quotes. And he has this great quote. It's something like this. All people are matter. And when matter interacts with other matter, it causes friction. Manners are the lubricant that basically get us through that, right? So when we're in a team environment, we can't always assume that people have the same upbringing or values we have around manners and politeness and respect. So you may have to learn how that works across a team, but just understanding this is how matter works. We're going to have friction. You're hoping it's functional conflict, like disagreeing about the work and decision-making, but not dysfunctional conflict. But you're hoping that you can create these psychologically safe environments where that friction gets finessed, right? I just love that.
So friction, like the rubber meeting the road and helping to get you down the road, as opposed to the brakes stopping the tires from moving, right? That type of friction.
Now I'd have to quote you instead of Peter Drucker.
And I was just going to actually bring in a quote. This is a personal quote, and I've used this at several organizations, but that is, psychological safety happens at the intersection of discomfort and delight. Like, it all can't be discomfort, right? It all can't be uncomfortable. There ought to be some level of healthy discomfort reinforced with pleasantry, with collegiality, with being generally just a good person. And so when those two things meet, that's where psychological safety becomes transformative. So I think it's critically important for people to see that as both, because we often phrase, psychological safety with this discomfort or the dissension or the dissonance that happens, but we ought to also make sure that we've got some delight in there as well.
Oh, I love that. So the other thing that I want to ask you, Tim, is about creating a space where people can provide critical feedback, either that be from leaders or from peers, while maintaining psychological safety. And so Sean shared, some ideas on that, like by asking people, how would you like to receive feedback so that you're not blindsiding people, determining that. But what are some other ways that, because feedback is critical. You need to get feedback in order to get better. But depending on the delivery or how a person is receiving it, it could be received negatively, even when it was just meant to be constructive. So how do you create an environment where critical feedback can be delivered without undue tension?
No, you're absolutely right. And I often say that all feedback is not created equal. Feedback is an important mechanism for us all to be better at what we do, better at who we are. But quite frankly, you're not going to receive feedback from an individual that you do not trust. So said differently, right? When we trust that the voice that is speaking to us is trustworthy, then we're more inclined to see what they're saying as valuable and as resonant and relevant to our work, rather than just a critique. And so one of the things that I would offer is that it's critically important that we create these feedback cultures where feedback isn't a thing that we do once a year or a thing that we do once a quarter, but that feedback is constantly happening and at all levels. I love Sean's idea, and I think it's a critically important one, and that is of ensuring that feedback is cyclical. I am often asking my teams, I did it yesterday, we had a meeting, and I offered an idea that I figured many of them would not agree with, but I offered it and followed up by saying, I don't think some of you all are going to agree with this. Please push back, right? Let's get to the best solution. And if what I am offering is not the best solution, then tell me that. And quite frankly, right, like, of no surprise, the idea that I offered, while good, was not the most refined. And they offered one that I thought about and pondered on and said, you know what? I like that better. Let's move in that direction. So creating this feedback culture is important, but being specific in your feedback is critically important. If you're going to give feedback in a psychologically safe way, but it's ambiguous and nebulous and no one can really understand, how does this really fit into what I'm doing, fit into my professional portfolio, doesn't speak to what I am accomplishing, they're not going to receive that as well. So being specific with your feedback is also important, but also practicing appreciative inquiry. It's not like icing on a cake of badness, right? It is actually a real strategic lever that you can pull for people to see, yes, I'm giving you maybe some uncomfortable feedback, but I also absolutely understand where your strengths lie. And that, for me as a leader, has been a profound transformative lever that I've used, where people know I'm not just seeing you at your worst or seeing you for the mistakes that you bring, but I'm absolutely focused on what the strengths you have that help us to move along as a team. And so I would offer that appreciative inquiry is so critical as well. And then providing critical feedback, while having that psychological safety is an art and a science. And so practicing that is also important, having that growth mindset approach. I'm not going to always get it right. I will not always create the most optimal environment for psychological safety. But in the moments I don't get it right, being able to say to an associate on my team, you know what? I think I might have been able to handle that differently. And I want you to know that I'm deeply committed to doing that. That also in and of itself creates that, that sort of trust and vulnerability that is necessary for the environments that we want to see.
Mhm.
Yes, all good. And I would say that, two points that you made. One about the vulnerability again. And then the second is that you don't have to, as a leader, just because you're the leader of the team doesn't mean that you have all the right answers, right? That's why you have smart, capable people working on your team so that you can all be better together. There's this old paradigm, I believe, where, you know, the leader makes all the decisions and they have all the answers, but that doesn't work in our current environment, and it doesn't do anything to make any of us better. If I have to have all the answers, then we're going to fail, because I'm nowhere near as intelligent as all of us together. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? No? Good.
I think Tim covered it all.
Good job, Tim. All right. So my next question is for Sean. Sean, how can leaders and organizations rebound from worst practices or failed attempts at creating psychological safety? Again, we don't have all the answers. We may think we're on the right road and then find out that we've taken a detour someplace dangerous. So how do we get back on the right path when we make the wrong choices in creating a psychologically safe environment?
Yeah, and sometimes we've seen this happen with putting out a statement that's tone deaf, or that backfires, or tries to implement something across an organization that's too little too late, or actually just is culturally not that competent, you know. But so a couple of ways to answer this. It can be pretty powerful to have employees share for themselves what keeps them psychologically safe, instead of just assuming it. Like we tend to think as leaders or as people implementing things that we've read the research, we've seen the polls, we like. But each organization is different. Each person is different. So you have to really kind of like feel out what's going to really matter in this particular culture. I think about rebounding from mistakes and worst practices is about humility and authenticity, a deep, deep humility. I struggle with this as a leader sometimes. Like we're just really just like, assuming that you just don't have maybe all the tools to do what you're setting out to do. Your heart can be in the right place and you really want to do this and commit the resources and the time and the energy, but you might not be the best messenger, or you might not have actually had the best plan. That takes some humility. My experience is that people want to be generous and that they want to give the benefit of the doubt to other people. So you just got to create the permission for people to do that. So when people make a mistake, just be like, I think this person was actually trying to do a really good thing for us. And that matters. Like that gesture matters more than the results sometimes. And that means that we're on the right track, that people are trying to implement solutions here. If it backfires, then listen to feedback that people give in traditional channels and non-traditional channels. There might be employees talking amongst themselves. Some people don't like that kind of gossip. Some people see that as an opportunity that is rich for feedback, right? And that might be a dedicated Slack channel that people are using, or some Glassdoor or whatever it is. But there's concerns that people raise, and then there's the concern behind the concern, which is like the real thing you want to get at and find, right? Teams can't perform at their best if they're afraid. So if we have to set the tone, model this behavior, and how to respond to dissent, or I talked about that earlier, but how you respond to like bad news, right? Like you just made this mistake, how you respond to your own error is going to like send a message and signal to the team, to stakeholders, everyone else. But building trust is really key. You have to really keep your word. And so if you are committed to learning and getting better, then just, again, employing that humility. And I think that a lot of the trust that is built in organizations is based on familiarity and rapport. So you can't just show up to your team, virtually or physically, say hi in the morning, flip on the coffee, go to work, and then never really interact with people. You've got to create situations where you are going to understand and get to know each other. There's this term I like in Spanish, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, but this term is conocimiento, which is, there's no English equivalent, but it basically means ways of knowing. And the way I have learned it through Rockwood Leadership and some other places is that it means putting people before task. It's like a way that you like actually engage with people and know them, and asking about their kids and their families, and that rapport builds that trust. It's like a currency. And then the last thing I'll say is like adopting a policy or implementing something across an organization is one thing, but if it doesn't land right, then you've got some unpacking to do. And there's another quote from Peter Drucker that I love. which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have all of the best intentions in the world, but if the culture isn't going to receive what you're sending, and the culture could be an organization or the country, like this new ad campaign you're rolling out, everyone's like, what the heck? And they turn it into a meme and reverse it. Like if it just doesn't have meaning for the people absorbing it, your strategy will be devoured before breakfast, right? So culture eats strategy for breakfast. You have to change the culture, and the culture is this top-down, sides-in way of being authentic about creating psychologically safe teams.
Thank you so much for that. And I hope that everyone on this call, I have been taking notes throughout, and I hope you are as well, because this is good stuff. And I'm going to be taking some of these ideas back to my own team to help implement so that we can reinforce. I'm not going to say create, because we've created, but reinforce our environment of psychological safety. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Next question for all of you. So I would like for each of you to take an opportunity to respond to this. How can organizations measure and assess the level of psychological safety in their workplace? So Tim, you mentioned before your engagement survey. There are other ways of doing it. So what are some additional ways of assessing whether or not you've created the environment you're intending to create?
I'll pop in very quickly. I agree that there are multiple ways. We often go straight to the overall organizational engagement assessment. So I'm going to stay away from that one. That's what I call your trust thermometer, your annual thermometer that you can gauge the organizational trust. And you need to be honest and sit with whatever you receive in terms of that feedback. That's important, but that's not the only method or lever that we have. I would argue that from a management perspective, from a people leader perspective, really thinking about those subtle cues, right? I'm always a gauger and a monitor of human behavior, but particularly on my team, where there's body language differences or hesitations or guarded expressions that I've never seen in the behavior of an associate on my team. Paying attention to that is a way to measure and assess the psychological safety on your team, right? When that is missing, it's not necessarily a very loud reverberation of someone being unsafe, but it's a whisper that might indicate that they're not as safe on the team as you thought that they might be. So being able to follow up with them strategically and have that conversation about, hey, I noticed you have kind of faltered, or you've veered off a little bit in terms of your engagement, or whatever the behavior is. Being able to call that out in a safe way is critically important. And I really think that the true measure of psychological safety really lies in the stories of the people who share their stories around vulnerability. So yes, one thing to quantify, I think that we should always do that. We should definitely have some measurable, quantifiable impact. But when you think about the narratives and the stories and the impact, being able to raise those voices to the fore is critically important as well.
Will
If I
or
could,
Sean? Go ahead,
yeah,
Will.
if I could jump in on what Tim just shared, which was excellent, by the way. He actually touched on. I made a couple of bullets for myself, to share with regards to that particular question. Regularly scheduled check-ins is something that I think Tim mentioned. So having that one-on-one with employees and listening, right? Having that, that empathy that we spoke about earlier is something that's extremely important, because if you're having a one-on-one and someone is sharing, but yet, the message is not being, received, that certainly can get in the way of, creating, again, that psychologically safe space. Observing team dynamics and interactions, which I think, again, touched on what Tim just shared. But one of the things that I have is monitoring turnover rates, and really listening to in those exit interviews, right? If there's an issue, with regards to the culture, that certainly will manifest itself in terms of the conversations that's had during those exit interviews. And we shouldn't always take it that, oh, well, this person just wanted to go elsewhere. They're just not interested in being here. There's nothing wrong with us, right? Certainly, reflecting inward and accepting that, hey, you know what, perhaps there's, there are some items that we could do better, and that we need to take note, if we have certain things coming up on more than one occasion, right? That different employees that are leaving the company are sharing the same concerns or lack of safety, right? We should definitely listen to those. And then the last thing that I had with regards to this is, has to do with those annual surveys. But adding to them, saying that there should also be pulse surveys, right? So you don't have to necessarily wait, for once a year to send out surveys, but you can also do pulse surveys just to get an understanding of, what's happening within a particular group or how people are feeling generally. It doesn't have to be as long even as those annual surveys. And then when you get those back, trying to break them down in age, gender, race, ethnicity, and seeing how different ethnic groups might respond to a particular question, how different genders respond to a particular question, right? Breaking those demographics down is something that's important to have an understanding of measuring, and then using those measurements to create a psychologically safe space.
And Sean?
Yeah, I wasn't going to answer this one, but I'm going to take the risk of sounding promotional here, and
You can answer the next one if you'd like.
I will answer the next one. I'm just
Okay.
going to put a link in here for folks to. There's a blog post that I wrote to help nonprofits measure their effectiveness creatively when you can't measure metrics. So different ways, and there's some things in here that I think, just really quickly, now that I've stepped in, I'm just going to do it really quick. I'm sorry. But to Tim's question, response about sometimes the metrics aren't really the thing. Sometimes it's about the wisdom that your organization has gathered. It's the resilience. It is the credibility. It is the deeper relationships, the talent you've acquired. So sometimes you can't measure it in a survey, right? But you can look at these other things. That's why I dropped in this link, because are you achieving your goals? Goal achievement is a measure, right? But if you can't have these neat metrics, there are other ways to look at stuff. So sorry about that. I said I wasn't going to talk, and then I did.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much for the link as well. I would also just like to add to this that I think that in group settings, if you don't hear anyone saying anything, that also is a measurement of whether or not people feel psychologically safe. Because if no one's saying anything, guess what? They don't feel comfortable. If there's more water cooler talk than there is discussion in the room, you know that you have work to do. I'm going to ask you one final question, and then we're going to go to the audience. So the last question that I have is about creating psychological safety for yourself. You may not always be in an organization or on a team where there is the environment of psychological safety, but it's important that each of us have a voice and that we share our voice and our opinions and thoughts on things so that we can create space for ourselves to be our best. How would one go about in an environment where they may be building towards psychological safety, but they haven't gotten there yet? How does one go about doing that for themselves? Sean, can you start us off?
Sure. There's a nonprofit I work with named Kid Power. They're the world's leading organization for teaching safety skills to people. And they do talk about psychological safety. They do talk about emotional safety. Because we're heading into the holidays, I'll just talk about some things that they bring up that I think could be useful to folks. So I never thought about this before, but they teach people, because they also work on bullying prevention and everything, that it is a powerful device for individuals to learn about their own safety. It is a powerful device to put your hand up, not in someone's face, but head up close to yourself and say, please stop. Like whether you're getting hit on at the bar by someone you don't want to, or some family members bringing up something polarizing at Thanksgiving, or some employee is saying something and just triggering the heck out of you, just putting your hand up close to yourself and saying, please stop. Because most people don't realize they're doing something offensive or intruding or anything. It is a powerful, transferable, and free tactic that individuals can do to create some emotional safety. Another tactic is to change the subject. Change the subject. Something's happening right now that is making you uncomfortable or making you not feel safe. Change the subject. Or get help. Like someone saying something that is just to go talk to a peer or a friend or someone you confide in at work. Know that there's someone you can confide in, know where that person is. Leave the conversation, not just change the subject, walk away. Like these are things you can do to keep yourself emotionally and psychologically safe in certain situations until you sort out your emotions or your feelings. These are just a couple of things that Kid Power teaches that I always like to share with folks, and they're universal. So I just wanted to jump in with those.
Thank you so much. Will?
Sure. Practicing self-care is something that I think can certainly help individuals with psychological safety. And I think Sean touched on this, personal boundaries, right? Having those those boundaries, and having the ability to express oneself as to when you feel that someone may be crossing that line. But with that, I would say that folks need to communicate honestly and respectfully. That respectful part is something that's extremely important, in light of everything that's happening in the world today, right? And how our society is functioning and dealing with one another, and those tendencies have a way of trickling into the workplace at times. So certainly, being honest and being respectful is something that we have to start with, within us. Um, Having a mindset of being open-minded, right, and seeking support, when needed. Those are important things to recognize in terms of our own psychological safety. And then the last thing that I'll offer is having a mindset of growth and resilience. Not everything that we encounter is going to be exactly as we plan or as we desire. So being resilient is, and to feedback, right? Feedback that could actually help us grow, help us to be, better at our jobs. If it's outside of work, better in terms of, our personal lives. Those are the nuggets that I have.
Thank you for that. And Tim, will you close us out, please?
I will. I actually think it's critical to engage in what I call courageous self-advocacy. And that is a phrase that sounds very difficult to do, because it is. But I believe that it's critical that we get to the place where we're constantly being able to advocate for ourselves. It's, especially if you're in the DEI space, it's very easy for us to get into the advocacy role. We do it all the time, but not all of us have mastered the idea and the practice of advocating for ourselves. I'll give you a story in a moment, but as I think about self-advocacy, I really think about every day doing something in a way to get you to practice that level of vulnerability. You're not going to be the top of the self-advocacy food chain day one, but if every day you're doing something that you can go home and say, you know what, I am incredibly proud of the decision I made to be vulnerable today in this small or very significant way, then you get to that level of like it being a muscle that is constantly being used. I had to have a chat, probably the second job I've ever had in my life, with an individual who I greatly admired, I greatly respected, but that individual was not giving me good feedback. And that individual did not share my same immutable characteristics. I'm a person of color, they were not. And I had a conversation with him that went somewhat like this. I really admire and respect you in this organization, but I'd like to give you the same, I'd like to receive rather, the same feedback that I see you giving other people across the organization. That's what's gonna help me grow. And I know that what's inside of you can help be transformative to what I'm trying to become professionally, but it doesn't happen if you don't give me that same level of feedback. That was a hard conversation to have to someone who was 2 or 3 tiers higher than I. But I knew in order for me to grow in that way, I needed him to have that level of feedback with me at our skip levels. And so after that conversation, what he said to me was, I'll be honest with you, I did not know how to effectively communicate feedback with you. Not that I didn't have any, but I didn't know that you were, one, if you could differentiate between the feedback that I'd give, or if it might hit you differently because of your identities. And we had a conversation that was very difficult for both of us, but out of that, fixed the issue. And so that was an example of courageous self-advocacy, going above and beyond to really show and display that you care about your success. And so, inclusive leadership, psychological safety really compels us to be able to be advocating for ourselves as we advocate for others. And then the last thing I'll say is to really find a network of individuals who can be your champions as well. I have not been at an organization where I didn't have at least one person who I knew really wanted me to succeed, really wanted my work to advance, really believed in the work that we were doing. And so out of that, I definitely had an opportunity to have someone that I could be vulnerable with, share with, have as a champion or a sponsor. And so, yes, there may be moments professionally where it feels as though there is literally no one in your circle or your sphere of influence in your organization that might be able to be that advocate. But I think if we look hard enough, and if we continue to be vulnerable, this might be my optimism showing, but that there will be at least one person who can be that person in your network to help you in those moments as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily now for any questions that may have come in the chat or to her directly. Emily, any questions for the panel?
Hi, thank you so much, Lori, and to our panelists. That was such an inspiring and impactful conversation. I'm really just blown away by the amount of information that you guys have shared in such a small amount of time. We do have a couple questions that have come to me directly. Our first is about active listening. So Will mentioned earlier that active listening is a learned skill. It's something we need to develop, thinking of very young children, right? They're not the greatest at active listening. How can individuals, first of all, learn and then practice and continue to hone their active listening skills? And what maybe prompts or speaking points do you have to show someone you are actively listening with either your body language or your actual verbal language?
That's an excellent question. And the first thing that comes to mind for me, the first word that comes to mind is respect, right? And that will certainly help, with regards to practicing active listening, right? The same respect that I want when I am expressing something to someone, right? Whether you're in a relationship, whether you are a parent, whether you're communicating with a colleague or a friend, you want to be heard, right? In the same way that I wish to be heard, it's the same way I'm going to afford someone the same courtesy, right? And there's that empathy part, right? I'm going to afford them that same courtesy in terms of actively listening to what it is that they're trying to express. The second thing that comes to mind is that, and I think Laurie touched on this earlier, is that I am not a know-it-all, right? And the fact that I don't know it all, and the fact that I recognize that we are stronger as a team than we are individually, means that I am going to, hear what, someone else's perspectives. And that work perspective is key, right? We could be standing facing the same direction, but because someone has a slightly different angle, they're able to see things or see something that I cannot, right? So I'm certainly going to, use those words to, to ensure that I listen actively. And Emily, I apologize. What was the last part of that question?
The last part would be, how might I show someone I'm actively listening, either with my body language or verbal cues?
In terms of verbal cues or body language, certainly leaning in, the term leaning in is a real thing, right? But we have to, in terms of, verbal cues or body language, we have to always be careful, not to cross certain boundaries, right, of what makes someone else feel, entirely comfortable in that conversation. If we're having a face-to-face conversation, if it's a Zoom call, right, which we're on right now, Tim is doing it as I'm speaking, right? He's shaking the head and certainly acknowledging, the words, and I know that he's actively listening to to what it is that I'm sharing with you. So that's what I have there. Yep.
Timothy or Sean, would you like to add anything before I move to our next question?
Just two or three things that are popping up for me that I try to do. One is memory hooks. So as someone is speaking, I am associating what they're saying to something else, right? Not in like a deflective way, but in a way that helps me to remember what they are saying. So I'm associating what they're saying and trying to figure out how can I apply what they're saying to various different parts of the conversation that I've heard. And it's been really, really positive in terms of the reception that I've heard from my associates on my team specifically, using memorable quotes. So if I hear something that's very compelling, I'll repeat it back to them to say how that really was compelling, or what I thought about that particular point that they made. And then paraphrasing creatively. So not like spitting someone's words back out at them, but as you're actively listening to them, thinking about, okay, what does this mean? And how can I paraphrase this in a way to show that I've actually digested it, not just like listen to respond, but I've actually digested what they said in a way that helps me to kind of show some level of competence. And the last thing, I think I said the last thing before, but you have to excuse me. That's like a preacher thing. And I happen to be a minister, so but the last thing I really will say on this is pausing and reflecting. And so you don't have to immediately respond to someone as they begin to offer, complaints or feedback. But if you just take, even if it's 5 seconds, those 5 seconds will feel like 15 or 30, but it shows some level of visible commitment to digesting and understanding and hearing what they say. So that 5 seconds of just pausing and reflecting shows that, you know what, instead of just spitting out what comes up, I'm going to think critically about how might I be able to respond to this in a way that gets us both to some level of resolve.
Thank you. Great points. So my next question actually involves Zoom and hybrid work arrangements. Have you seen any impact on your teams within your organization's psychological safety in moving to a more hybrid or remote workflow, right? We know that familiarity and rapport are what lead to that trust that is so critical to people feeling psychologically safe. So how can we implement some of that into Zoom situations where it seems very robotic sometimes? This could be for anyone.
I think just one thing to be aware of is that with the move to teleconferencing or Zoom or whatever, there are cultural things that start to emerge on your team about who wants to be off camera when they're at home, what's acceptable when asking your teams to be on camera, whenever you're trying to show any kind of respect, please be in your seat. Don't be walking around your kitchen. Make time for this meeting. I made time for you, right? Like, there are cultural things happening in the way we want to engage. Some people literally have to be moving around a bunch. I can't do a desk for 8 hours. I have to sometimes stand and move around a little bit, but this can culturally be difficult for some people who might see it as a sign of disrespect that you're not actually like paying attention. And some folks are like, I don't have a good setup at home for this. And there's things going on you can't see off camera that are making me have to move. I can't see you and because of the light or whatever. So with this shifting work environment, just setting some norms, and then where the exceptions to those norms can be for neurodivergent folks, for folks who are just like, they absorb screen time differently. And then just trying to get away from screen time could be a practice that for some people is a deliberate way to increase people deciding when they want to engage versus like having to engage in meetings and then showing up cranky. That's just one couple of things I think of.
Thank you. Okay, so my last question, because we are at the end of our Q&A session, is for each of you to share one takeaway that our attendees can implement tomorrow. So one small way that they can increase psychological safety either for themselves or for their teams, starting tomorrow, getting this, right off the ground and running.
From a micro perspective, I'd say a very tactical way for people to get involved and excited around psychological safety is to really create those safety norms on your team. Asking your teams to collaboratively come up with, what does safety look like for this team? It'll look differently from the teams outside of your team. But if in essence, there is a clear understanding of what safety looks like for everyone in your team, people can hold themselves accountable and there can be group accountability. Until there's a level of visibility and awareness, there's no real accountability. You can't be accountable for things you don't know. So being able to have that conversation, so when things that are outside of your safety norms happen, you can revisit those norms and say, hey, we collectively said, this is how we're going to move forward with respect to psychological safety. So asking those questions, and then I'll end by saying, don't be afraid when those responses challenge you to be better, challenge you to think differently, because there could be things that you're doing explicitly or implicitly that are not safe for the people that you are working with. So in the event that is the case, sit with that. If it makes you uncomfortable, right? Challenge the uncomfortable or the discomfort that you feel so that you can move forward as well. But having those norms, revisiting them every now and then, I think is a really tactical way for us to do that.
And for me, I'll share that it's doing a self-pulse survey, right, with your team, and the things that you find that are coming up, from more than one person is bringing up, taking those things back and reflecting a bit, a bit more on those and working on those items.
I would say Tim's early piece about checking your own biases and your own assumptions and errors in judgment that you might be bringing to certain situations is really important, including like being critical of orange cats. We've learned today that you just cannot do that. Number one rule. And I definitely just think that was one of my takeaways today. No bashing orange cats.
Yes, thank you. And I just like to add that I will encourage you all to be social anthropologists. Like, just take a step back from your role as a team leader or a leader in any way, and just observe your team and their interactions in group settings, and then their interactions in one-on-one settings with you or with others. And you can then assess whether or not someone is bringing their full self to, larger groups, and whether or not there is some discomfort there and what that discomfort might be, so that you can address it. Also observe them in situations where you may be joining them in a meeting with other people, whether or not they feel comfortable bringing their ideas to that conversation, because then you can address it outside of your team in a larger capacity. Because one of our responsibilities as leaders is not only creating psychological safety for ourselves and our teams, but also helping the rest of the people around us to better understand what that means and what it looks like for your team, for their team, for the organization, so that we can all do better together, because we are interdependent, whether we want to be or not.
Thank you. Thank you. Such great takeaways. I'm going to unpin everybody right now. Give me 1 second to do that so I can close us out. This was an amazing discussion. Let's see. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Again, thank you to Lori, Will, Timothy, and Sean for providing such an excellent segment today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge, ideas, and best practices for us. I think there was a plethora of information and real tangible ways that our attendees can go back to their own teams and organizations and really start implementing psychological safety and growing that within their organizations. To our event attendees, I am going to put a code up on our screen right now. 1 second. Here it is. For you to please hover your phone over. Oh, resume share. Let's see. Give me a second.
You are in a safe environment, Emily. Take your time.
There's always something, right? So, okay,
yes,
here we
is.
go. It should now stay, but this is our QR code for the meeting survey link. We ask that you please hover your phone over the QR code. You'll be prompted to give your feedback on today's session. I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes after our meeting concludes. We would really love to gather your feedback to continue to enhance our future programs. I will also be sending the survey code out in our follow-up thank you email to all of the attendees. Again, thank you for coming and for listening to this amazing panel share their wisdom. We hope you have a wonderful remainder of your week and a safe and happy holiday weekend, a holiday next week. Thank you for attending, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Emily.